The Zorvan flagship, the Zenith, floated silently through space, its once glowing engines now cold and dark. Inside, chaos brewed. The ship's crew, proud members of a species known across the galaxy for its technological prowess, moved frantically between consoles. The captain, tall and imposing, stood with his arms folded, glaring at the malfunctioning control panels. "We've tried every diagnostic," one of the engineers said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "The AI systems can't pinpoint the issue. It's like the ship has simply shut down on us." The captain scowled, his pride wounded by the fact that their flagship, the epitome of Zorvan engineering, was now adrift. "Impossible. This vessel represents the peak of our technology. There must be an answer in the data." He clenched his fist. "There is always an answer in the data." Another crew member piped up. "Sir, we've rerouted power several times. We've reset the AI core, but nothing works. The ship isn't responding, and our systems can't diagnose the problem." The captain glanced at the massive screen in front of him. The Zenith was stranded in an isolated part of space, far from any of their allies or repair stations. They had no choice. They needed help. With a reluctant sigh, he ordered, "Send out a universal distress signal. Any vessel that can assist, Zorvan or otherwise, must respond." The engineer hesitated. "Sir, that would mean—" "I know what it means," the captain snapped. "We're not asking for advice, we're commanding assistance. Do it." As the message was sent, the Zorvans waited. Minutes turned to hours, and their pride turned to frustration as silence filled the communication channels. No responses. Their reputation was formidable, and likely, other species saw their distress signal as beneath them, or worse, feared the implications of helping such a superior race. Suddenly, the console pinged. "We have a response," the communications officer said, disbelief clear in his voice. It's from a human freighter." The captain's face tightened. "Humans? Primitive beings from that backwater planet?" "Yes, sir. They're the only ones who've responded so far," the officer confirmed. The captain's irritation grew. Humans were known for their rudimentary technology. Their ships were basic, and their tools were laughably simple. To rely on them? It would be an insult to Zorvan pride. "I will not let those apes touch our ship," one of the engineers spat, his disdain barely masked. The captain considered his options. They had none. As much as he hated to admit it, even basic assistance was better than floating helplessly through space. He grimaced. "Open communication. Let them aboard." The bridge fell into an awkward silence. No one could believe they were lowering themselves to accept help from a species as far beneath them as humans. Moments later, the communication line connected, and on the screen appeared the human freighter, a battered, clunky ship with none of the elegance or efficiency of the Zorvan design. A human mechanic, Roy Keller, stood on the other end of the call, his expression casual, almost bored. "This the Zorvan ship that needs a hand?" he asked, his voice scratchy through the static. The Zorvans exchanged glances. The captain stepped forward. "We are indeed the Zorvan flagship, the Zenith, and it appears we have encountered an issue with our systems. We—" he hesitated, the words painful. "Require assistance." Keller leaned back in his chair, scratching his chin. "All right. I'll be there in a few. Shouldn't take long to figure out what's going on." The captain's eyes narrowed. How dare this human speak so casually about their prized vessel? He clenched his jaw. "Understand this, human. Our systems are far beyond the comprehension of your kind. Do not think you'll be able to solve this with your primitive methods." Keller grinned slightly. Yeah? We'll see." Minutes later, Keller's freighter docked with the Zenith, and the mechanic made his way aboard. The Zorvans, still standing stiff and formal, watched him closely as he entered their ship, his toolbox clinking at his side. He wore a weathered jumpsuit, stained with oil, his tools clearly well used and lacking the polish of Zorvan equipment. Keller looked around, unimpressed by the sleek, advanced design of the ship. "Nice place you got here," he said, though his tone made it sound more like a formality than a compliment. The captain led him to the malfunctioning systems. Our AI has failed to diagnose the issue. We've run every diagnostic, rerouted power, reset the core, and nothing. I doubt you'll be able to make sense of it, but as a courtesy for responding, you may try. Keller crouched down beside the system, barely listening to the captain's speech. He opened up a panel and pulled out a simple handheld device, running it over the wires and connections. The Zorvans watched, their eyes narrowed in suspicion. One of the engineers muttered, "He's just guessing. There's no way those tools can do anything." Keller smirked, clearly hearing the comment but choosing not to respond. "Looks like your problem's pretty simple," he said after a few moments. "You got a coupling that's burned out." "A coupling?" the captain repeated, incredulously. "Our systems would have detected that." Keller shrugged. "Sometimes the fancy stuff misses the basics. You overcomplicate things." He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a standard wrench, of all things, making the Zorvans recoil in disgust. "You're going to use that?" one of them asked, horrified. Keller didn't answer. He calmly got to work, replacing the coupling in a matter of seconds. The moment he tightened the last bolt, the entire ship hummed back to life. Lights flickered on, the AI systems rebooted, and the engines roared back to full power. "There you go," Keller said, standing up and wiping his hands on a rag. "Good as new." The Zorvans stared at him, dumbfounded. Their most advanced systems had been stumped by something Keller had fixed in seconds with nothing more than a wrench. The captain, speechless, couldn't bring himself to look Keller in the eye. Finally, one of the engineers stammered, How did you do that? Our AI didn't detect any of it." Keller just chuckled, packing up his tools. "Like I said, sometimes you overthink things. A ship's a ship. Doesn't matter how advanced it is, it's still made of parts. And parts break. Just gotta know how to look at it." Without another word, Keller turned and walked back toward his freighter, leaving the Zorvans in stunned silence. Keller stepped back onto the Zorvan ship with his usual casual demeanor, barely glancing at the sterile, overly complex corridors that seemed to scream of excess. Everything about the place was polished, too clean, too pristine for his liking. He was a mechanic, after all, and mechanics got their hands dirty. These aliens seemed to think their shiny tech was too good for that. As he made his way towards the malfunctioning systems, a Zorvan officer eyed him, clearly uncomfortable with the presence of a human on their ship. Keller wasn't bothered. He had seen that look plenty of times before. Most alien species, the Zorvans especially, looked down on humans. Fine by him. He wasn't here to make friends, he was here to fix what was broken. "Where's the problem?" Keller asked, his tone flat. He didn't need pleasantries. The Zorvans sure as hell weren't offering any. One of the engineers led him to the central system. The room was filled with all sorts of advanced tech, flashing lights, floating holograms, machines humming and buzzing like they were doing something important. Keller raised an eyebrow. He'd seen setups like this before, overblown, overly complex, and usually completely unnecessary. But he wasn't here to critique their choices, just fix the mess they'd gotten themselves into. The Zorvan engineer beside him folded his arms, looking smug. "Our systems have run over 100 diagnostics. No errors detected. We've rerouted all auxiliary power and run full system resets multiple times. Clearly, there's nothing for you to find here. But since you insisted on coming aboard, we'll let you try." Keller smirked at the engineer's arrogance. "Sure," he said with a shrug, dropping to one knee and opening the access panel. "I'll give it a look." He pulled out his diagnostic scanner, a small, handheld device that looked embarrassingly simple next to the Zorvan's sophisticated equipment. As soon as the scanner beeped, Keller nodded to himself. "Yep, just what I thought," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for the Zorvan engineers to hear. The lead engineer, now looking a bit more nervous, leaned in. "What did you find?" Keller didn't even look up from his work. "Burnout coupling." "Impossible," the Zorvan replied, disbelief written across his face. "Our diagnostics would have detected something that simple." Keller finally looked up, meeting the Zorvan's eyes. Well, they didn't. Your systems are too busy trying to solve problems that aren't there. Sometimes the small stuff gets overlooked when you're trying to be too clever. The Zorvan engineer frowned. We'll see. Fix it then. Keller just nodded, reaching into his toolbox and pulling out his wrench. The look on the Zorvans' faces was priceless. They clearly had never seen such a primitive tool before. One of them actually recoiled slightly, as if the wrench itself was an offense to their entire species. Ignoring their disgust, Keller got to work. It wasn't complicated. In fact, it was the kind of repair he could have done in his sleep. He tightened a few bolts, swapped out the fried coupling for a spare he carried, and within seconds the problem was fixed. Simple. There, Keller said, standing up and giving the panel a pat. That should do it. The Zorvans stared at him, wide-eyed, waiting for something more. When the hum of the ship returned, signaling everything was back online, their jaws practically dropped. Keller couldn't help but chuckle at their disbelief. The captain, who had been silently observing, stepped forward, his face a mix of confusion and irritation. That's it. That's it, Keller confirmed, wiping his hands on a rag. Told you, just a coupling. But our systems, they didn't detect any fault. Yeah, Keller interrupted. Because your systems are too complicated. They're too busy running through every possible scenario that they miss the obvious stuff. Happens all the time when you over-rely on tech. The Zorvan captain didn't respond immediately. His pride was clearly stung, but he wasn't about to admit it outright. The other Zorvans exchanged looks, still trying to process what had just happened. Keller could feel their disbelief, but he didn't care. He'd done his job. The ship was fixed. That's all that mattered. Without another word, Keller packed up his tools and headed for the exit. He wasn't one for dragging things out or basking in glory. This was just another job, no different than any other. But as he walked away, he couldn't resist throwing one last glance over his shoulder at the still bewildered Zorvans. You're welcome, he said with a smirk, then stepped back onto his freighter. Keller's footsteps echoed as he walked back towards the engine room, toolbox in hand, still shaking his head at how overcomplicated the Zorvans had made everything. He wasn't one to brag, but this job was almost too easy. The aliens, with all their tech and arrogance, couldn't see the forest for the trees. It was just a basic coupling. Any mechanic worth his salt would have caught that right away. He crouched back down, double-checking his work out of habit. The coupling was seated correctly, the new one snugly in place, wires connected and everything secure. It wasn't rocket science, but apparently, it was to these aliens. He heard some hushed conversations in the background, Zorvans speaking in their native tongue, clearly bewildered by how quickly things were turning around. The Zorvan captain, still stiff with pride, stepped forward. How did you manage that so quickly? He asked, though it pained him to admit it. Keller didn't even look up from his final check. Like I said, you guys are too focused on the fancy stuff. Sometimes the answer's a lot simpler than you think. He tapped the coupling lightly with his wrench. This thing was fried. Just needed a new one. You're lucky it didn't take out the whole system. The captain narrowed his eyes. Our diagnostics would have detected any critical failure. Keller stood up and faced him, shrugging. Maybe. But you're running diagnostics on systems so advanced they don't even know when something's gone wrong with basic parts. Sometimes, tech can only get you so far. After that, you need a bit of common sense. The Zorvan engineers were now gathered around, some looking frustrated, others genuinely curious. One of them finally spoke, the disbelief in his voice apparent. You mean to tell us that this entire system malfunction was caused by a simple mechanical failure? A coupling? Yup, Keller said, popping the P for emphasis. A little part that your systems probably overlooked. It's not a fault in your tech, but sometimes machines don't think like we do. You need the human touch. One of the younger Zorvan engineers looked fascinated, despite himself. But how could something so small cause such a widespread failure? Keller smiled slightly. That's the thing. Doesn't matter how advanced your systems are. If one tiny part fails, it can ripple through everything. You gotta treat the little things with the same respect you give the big, shiny gadgets. The captain's face tightened. And you used that tool? He pointed to the wrench in Keller's hand, as if it were some kind of relic from a primitive past. Keller glanced at the wrench, then back at the captain. Yeah. It works. Been using tools like this for years. Sure, they're not fancy, but they get the job done. The Zorvan engineer who had spoken earlier stepped forward, looking intrigued. You humans rely on such rudimentary methods? Yet it worked faster than all of our systems combined. Sometimes simple works best, Keller replied, packing up his tools. You guys seem to think more tech means fewer problems. Doesn't always work that way. The more complex you make something, the more points of failure there are. You'll learn that eventually. There was a long pause as the Zorvans digested what he'd said. Keller didn't expect them to admit he was right, not outright, anyway. They had too much pride for that. But he could see it in their faces, a grudging respect, mixed with a little confusion. They couldn't figure out how something as basic as a wrench could have saved their state-of-the-art vessel. It probably went against everything they'd ever been taught. Keller slung his toolbox over his shoulder, heading for the docking bay. He could feel the weight of their stares, a mixture of disbelief and, perhaps, a newfound curiosity about the human race. They wouldn't admit it, but this experience had shaken their view of humans and their supposed superiority. Before he reached the door, the captain called out to him. Wait! Keller paused, glancing back over his shoulder. The captain's expression was strained, but he managed to get the words out. We appreciate your assistance. Keller nodded, not making a big deal of it. No problem. Just doing my job. The Zorvan captain hesitated, clearly not used to being in a position where he had to offer thanks to a species he had considered beneath him. Perhaps we've been too quick to dismiss your kind. Keller didn't smile, but there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Maybe. Or maybe you just needed a different perspective. The silence hung for a moment before Keller turned and continued walking. As he approached the docking bay, he couldn't help but think how funny it all was. All their advanced tech, their shiny ships, their arrogance, and all it took was a wrench and some old-fashioned human know-how to put them back on track. His boots clanged on the metal ramp as he stepped onto his freighter. He glanced back one more time, seeing the Zorvan crew clustered around the engine room, still trying to comprehend how their Galaxy-class ship had been fixed by someone from a species they barely considered intelligent. Before closing the hatch, Keller muttered to himself with a small grin. Yep, sometimes simple's all you need. As Keller's freighter detached from the zenith, he leaned back in his chair, watching the Zorvan ship slowly regain its former glory. The ship's lights flickered back on, engines thrumming with life once more. He figured the Zorvans were still inside, scratching their heads, trying to reconcile what had just happened. They had dismissed human ingenuity without a second thought, but now they had no choice but to respect it, whether they liked it or not. A quiet chuckle escaped him. Fancy ship, no common sense, he muttered, shaking his head. Keller wasn't one to gloat, but it was hard not to take a bit of satisfaction in how things had turned out. These high and mighty aliens had expected nothing from him. But the job was done, and they were flying again, thanks to a simple human tool and some elbow grease. Back on the zenith, the Zorvan captain stood in the middle of the engine room, still staring at the newly installed coupling. The hum of the ship had returned, systems had rebooted flawlessly, and their AI was no longer in a loop. His pride, however, had taken a hit. He couldn't deny it. Everything they knew about humans had been turned on its head. This human, with his crude tools, had fixed what their advanced technology couldn't even diagnose. One of the younger engineers broke the silence. How did we miss something so basic? His voice carried a mixture of frustration and disbelief. He looked at the captain, searching for an explanation that would make sense of the situation. The captain took a deep breath, but no satisfying answer came to him. We've grown dependent on our systems, he said slowly. We trust our technology to handle every aspect of our operations. Maybe too much. The lead engineer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke, his voice laced with something that sounded a lot like humility. "It's not just about the technology, is it? The human, he saw something we didn't. It's not that his tools are more advanced, it's that he knew how to look for the problem in a way we didn't consider." The captain nodded, though he hated admitting it. He didn't rely on the system. He trusted his instincts, his experience. He paused, glancing at the wrench Keller had left behind, almost like a trophy of their humiliation. "We've forgotten how to do that." The younger engineer frowned. "But why? Why would a species so far behind us be able to fix something we couldn't?" The lead engineer sighed, his voice softening. "Perhaps it's because we've complicated things unnecessarily. We believe that everything must be solved with more technology, more automation. But sometimes, the simpler approach works just as well, if not better." The captain couldn't argue with that. He remembered Keller's words, how the mechanic had pointed out their obsession with overcomplication. It stung, but it was true. The Zorvans had prided themselves on being the most advanced species in the galaxy, but in their pursuit of perfection, they had lost touch with the fundamentals. He glanced at the crew, all of whom were silent now, reflecting on the encounter. They had all been so sure, so dismissive of the human and his tools. And yet, Keller had shown them up, without breaking a sweat. The captain's pride was wounded, but there was something else there too, a grudging respect. He wouldn't say it out loud, but in the back of his mind, he knew this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths with humans. Next time, though, they wouldn't be so quick to judge. "We'll need to review our systems," the captain said after a long silence. "Not just the diagnostics, but how we approach problems like this in the future. It's clear that our reliance on technology has blinded us to the simpler solutions." The lead engineer nodded. "Perhaps we should even study some of the human methods. They may be primitive, but they clearly have a different way of thinking that could complement our own." The captain's lips tightened. He didn't like the idea of learning from a species they had always considered beneath them. But he knew there was no denying what had happened. Perhaps. Meanwhile, back on his freighter, Keller sat at the control panel, plotting his course for the next job. He didn't think much more about the Zorvans. To him, they were just another client in a long line of over-engineered ships with underthought problems. His job was simple: fix the problem and move on. He knew they'd be talking about him for a while, though. It wasn't every day that a human mechanic walked onto a Zorvan flagship and fixed something their AI couldn't even identify. The irony wasn't lost on him. He figured they'd eventually come around, realize that maybe humans weren't as primitive as they thought. Maybe, just maybe, they'd see that sometimes the simplest tools were the most effective. As he leaned back in his chair, the stars blurring into streaks of light as his freighter jumped to hyperspace, Keller couldn't help but smile. He wasn't one for glory or recognition, but he knew that somewhere out there, a group of Zorvans was reevaluating everything they thought they knew about humans. And that was enough for him. For the Zorvans, this was just the beginning of a long journey, a journey where they would have to reconsider their views on other species, particularly the humans they had dismissed for so long. They would have to rethink the way they approached problems, blending their advanced technology with a newfound respect for the basics. And Keller? He'd be out there, fixing whatever came his way, one wrench turn at a time. Simple, effective, and always moving forward. That was just the way he liked it.